Hey y'all, I'm Carrie.
I'm Momo.
And this is Monstrous. Where the stories are strange, the shadows run deep, and the tea is always a little dark. Listener discretion is advised. Monstrous covers true crime, violence, and other unsettling subject matter that may be difficult for some listeners. All right, welcome back, guys. Part 2 of the Green River Killer, a.k.a. Gary Ridgway. I don't have any news or updates this week.
We've had a long weekend.
Yes, it's been a long weekend. We have a new 10-year-old in the house.
Lord help us all.
Okay, so we're just going to dive right into it. You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. So you saw that part 1 was challenging, and it was a lot. But it's not over yet. There's a lot more to the Green River Killer than what you learned in part 1. It's only going to get worse from here, okay? Because Gary Ridgway is a truly heinous individual. Now, like most true crime consumers, I knew this case. However, I didn't realize the extent of his crime spree until I delved into it myself. It spanned from the 1980s all the way to the 1990s, and it's mind-boggling to comprehend just how long he was active and how many times this man evaded capture. It's wild to realize that. So part 1 was obviously difficult. We had the Green River Killer Task Force, which had 9 bodies when we concluded at part 1. And let me tell you, Gary Ridgway isn't finished yet. When we ended last week, there was actually 12 victims. The task force was unaware of this fact, nor did they anticipate the severity of the situation they had on their hands. So on September 18th is when we ended. This is when Riker received a call about another discovery. So Riker is our investigator, and we've been discussing, him throughout this entire thing so far, and he's pretty much going to be throughout the entire series. A local resident had been searching for a lost chicken near Star Lake Road. Can you imagine that? Like, I'm just out here looking for my fucking chicken, and I find a dead body. Like, that lost chicken is going to be null and void at that fucking point. Like, I'm done. I don't want to search for another lost chicken again. I'm finished. Like, that's awful. I'm sorry. Okay, so this resident had stumbled upon the skeletal remains of 23-year-old Gail Matthews. After swiftly reviewing the reports of missing women that the task force had, they were fortunate enough to be able to identify her remains through x-rays that had been taken after a boating accident that she had had several years prior. So they identified Gail Matthews' remains pretty quickly. Now, Gail Matthews was an unusual case within the pool victim. Not only was she slightly older than the previous victims, but her missing persons report was significantly more detailed than what the detectives were accustomed to at the time. Often they received fragmented information because many of the women were living on the streets, and so they lacked regular health care or, support.
Right.
They had lost their family, their friends, their employers, leaving them without a place to stay and no one to keep tabs on them. But in 1982, Gail had been living with her boyfriend, Kurt, in a small apartment near the airport. And by the spring of 1983, both of them had unfortunately lost their jobs. And eventually, they lost their apartment. After this, the pair had drifted around and stopped at motels for a few months at a time and then moved on. Even before losing their apartment, though, Gail had been contributing to the bills. But she never disclosed how she made her money to Kurt. He just knew she was bringing money in, and he didn't ask no questions. Now, Kurt would occasionally win money gambling at small casinos around Seattle. And if they had a little bit more, then they would, splurge on a nicer hotel than just a regular, rundown place. However, when they had no money, they would have to sleep outside. And this happened on multiple occasions, unfortunately. I'm sorry if you guys hear my dog. He's out there going crazy. Now, the last time Kurt had saw Gail was on the night of April 22nd. They had gone out for a few beers at the VIP Tavern just a few blocks away from their motel. After drinking and playing a few rounds of Pac-Man, Kurt told Gail that he was going to play some cards at another bar that was nearby. He hoped to win some money, and he told her, quote, "I'll see you later." Gail agreed and said that she would try to make some money herself so that way they could get a nice hotel room for a few nights. They parted ways, and later that night, Kurt was walking from one tavern to another when he spotted Gail. He's ridiculous. Gail was sitting in the passenger seat of a Ford truck, which had been stopped at a red light. He waved to her, trying to get her attention, but he said that something about the scene just felt off. When he reported Gail missing the next day, he told FBI agent Duke Dietrich that she seemed in some kind of gaze, like she was just staring off. It appeared like she was looking at him, but as though she didn't actually see him, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. He said, I'm certain she could see me. It wasn't dark yet. And so he just continued to wave more vigorously because he's like, there's no way she didn't see me standing here. But Gail remained motionless, as if she was frozen in place. He remarked that her eyes were fixated on something that he couldn't see. And it wasn't just that Gail appeared dazed, which, he kind of found peculiar. He had also noticed that her body language seemed to be rather unusual as well. He described her as sitting beside a man whom Kurt had identified as being in his early 30s. The man wore a plaid shirt that gave him an appearance reminiscent of an outdoorsman. So probably like I'm trying to think. Kind of like the plaid shirts like the boys wear.
Yeah.
Like the woodsman. There we go. That's what I was trying to think of. The woodman's shirt. So furthermore, Gail's demeanor conveyed a sense of discomfort. It appeared as though she was pressing herself against the passenger door, trying to sit as far away from the driver as possible. And later, he confided in the agent, expressing his inability to articulate the reason behind his fear. So he's like, I don't know why I feel this way, but something was wrong. And I know something was wrong. He said that he felt a sense of dread for Gail, sensing that she was in immediate danger. Being driven by his instinct, he sprinted across the road, determined to reach the truck she was sitting in. Now, as Kurt approached the intersection, he realized that the driver had already started to pull away and sped down a side street. Despite his setback, he pursued the car relentlessly. He's on foot doing this, by the way. He is chasing this fucking truck on foot because he's like, something's not right. I can feel it. You know what I mean? That's some dedication right there.
Yeah, it is.
However, he quickly acknowledged the impossibility of catching them on foot due to his running pace. I mean, you're not going to catch up to a car. Like, it's just not going to happen. Now, that night, he did go back to the motel room, waiting for Gail to arrive. He tried to rationalize his actions, telling himself that he was just, overreacting and that everything was going to be fine. She was going to show up. The next morning, though, when she still had not returned, Kurt called the police to report her missing immediately. So he's like, I'm not fucking waiting any longer.
Right.
However, he was informed that since he wasn't related to her by blood or marriage, he couldn't file an official missing persons report.
That's dumb.
Right. That is the most absurd thing that I have ever heard. Like, so just because they're not married, they can't be partners.
Yeah, but you got to remember this was the 80s.
Yeah. It's ridiculous. Based on this logic, people don't have people who love them that aren't their spouse or family. How fucking stupid is that? Like, in this type of situation, does it really matter? What exactly changes the fact that she's missing? A piece of paper is what determines who can report someone missing. That is the most dumbest thing I've ever heard. Ugh. Anyway. Now, hearing this, Kurt, of course, felt, a sense of frustration and helplessness. He's like, I don't know what to do. So he decided to take matters into his own hands and search for Gail on his own. He was not going to sit by.
Wow, he must have really loved her.
Right, exactly. He's like, I'm not just going to sit here and wait for somebody else to realize that she's missing. I'm going to do what I got to do. So he went to all of their usual hangouts in the usual motels, but no one around there had seen her. He even walked the streets for several blocks, day and night, asking anyone, including other women that were working in the area, if they knew anything about her, but no one could recall seeing her. Now, during this time of searching, Kurt's mind kept going back to the Green River Killer. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been thinking about him regularly. He remembered seeing Gail in the truck and wondered if he had been mistaken. Did she actually seem dazed, or was he just projecting his own fears onto her? As he thought about it, he felt a growing sense of worry. What if she truly was missing? Now, Kurt couldn't help but second-guess himself. Was he just being paranoid? Was he imagining things? But deep down, he knew that something was actually wrong. He had seen Gail in the truck, and he had a feeling that she was in danger. And he couldn't shake it. He thought maybe she had actually seen him waving to her, but didn't want to alert the driver and put herself in more danger.
That could be.
Right. And she was in danger. Kurt knew that, and he was determined to find her. Now, as the weeks passed without a sign of her, Kurt's frustration grew. He felt helpless and alone. He couldn't believe that no one was going to help him. And so, he was left with no hope of finding her. And it was a terrible feeling. Kurt couldn't help but feel that sense of despair. He had been searching for Gail for weeks, and he had not yet been able to find her. But he was still determined, even though he was running out of time. Now, some people had suggested that she might have just left him, but he denied this. He firmly believed that Gail had not just simply up and left, regardless of how long she was gone. Now, Kurt proposed that they investigate the matter further and gather evidence before making any kind of conclusions. So now we're going to jump ahead to after they found her body, okay? So after they identified Gail's remains from the medical records, they immediately began searching the police logs for any kind of arrest or references to Gail Matthews. It was then that they finally discovered Kurt's 911 call. And fortunately, it was relatively easy to track Kurt down, because in September of 1983, he had been incarcerated in a Texas jail on drug charges. So at some point between there, he ended up in Texas.
Who the hell wants to go to Texas?
Now, the task force did have Kurt transferred to Seattle, where he was interviewed by police. Dr. John Berberich, which is the department psychologist, conducted this interview. Kurt had tried to recall any relevant information for the investigators and even agreed to be hypnotized, all in an effort to find out who did this to Gail. However, though, his memory was limited to basic details about the driver and the fact that the truck was definitely not new. He could only recall that it appeared to have been recently primed for painting. So it wasn't, it didn't have like that shiny paint.
Mm-hmm.
It was very matte. You know what I mean? And while this information was somewhat helpful, it didn't really provide any clear leads. So just 1 month after the discovery of Gail Matthews' body, more skeletal remains were found within the city. This time, it was in the woods off Black Diamond Road. Now, using their usual method of reviewing police reports, missing persons reports, medical records, and medical examiner reports, the task force identified this new victim as 19-year-old Yvonne Antosh. Her missing report had been filed by her friend and roommate. She had come to Seattle from Vancouver, British Columbia, with this person. Now, investigators presented Yvonne's photo to the other women working the strip, and a few did recognize her. One person recalled that they had seen her around May 30th, but no one had seen her since. Now, based on this report and the autopsy, her time of death was estimated to be around that May 30th date. However, just 2 weeks later, detectives on the task force had barely begun investigating Yvonne's background when another body was discovered near the airport. Another young couple. So, it's crazy that this happened twice, okay? So, yet another couple was off on a date picking apples. Don't go fucking pick apples, guys. Don't do it. This is your sign right here, all right? Don't do it. Let somebody else do it. Go buy them from the store or some shit. Anyway, another young couple that was going to pick apples in a vacant lot by the airport when I discovered yet another set of remains. So
that'll put the damper on a date.
Oh, yeah. You want to hear the real damper? So the woman had tripped and she fell onto her stomach. She landed in a pile of leaves. Her face was just inches away from what she described as a human leg bone.
Ew.
Yep. Could you imagine falling into a pile of leaves and you look up and there's a human leg bone right in front of your face?
No, thank you.
Yeah, no. Talk about some fucking PTSD, but right there.
No kidding.
Now, this woman obviously quickly jumped to her feet. They closely examined the object, which did turn out to be a leg bone, which was attached to a pelvis. And then a few feet away, they could see the top half of a human skull protruding from the dirt. I don't think I'd ever look at apples the same again.
Probably not.
Now, since this lot belonged to the airport, the report of human remains was then reported to the Port Authority instead of the Seattle Police or to the Green River Task Force. The authorities sealed off the area and decided to wait until the next morning to begin the investigation when the light would be better. What the fuck? Let's just leave these human bones here till in the morning. We'll come back. No big deal. What the fuck is wrong with you? So the next day came, and when the sun rose, the Port police arrived at the scene with a troop of. Are you ready?
I'm listening.
With a troop of local Boy Scouts.
Why would you bring children into the mix?
Yep.
Oh my God.
You didn't know that, did you?
No, I did not. A bunch of maroons.
Right. So apparently they often relied on the Boy Scouts to assist them in cases where a large law enforcement presence was necessary. I have no idea what part of the Boy Scouts curriculum includes crime scene training, but whatever part it is, I think maybe we need to reevaluate it because this is a group of young boys and young teens. And I think it's safe to say that they were not prepared for what they were being drugged into. And then also, when you need more police presence, why aren't you calling other police officers? Why are you calling up a Boy Scout troop leader and being like, hey, you want to get your boys together and come on here? We need help finding these human remains. Some good training. Like, I want to know what badge you're earning. Like, that's what I want to know. What badge is this called?
Stupidity.
Like, are these boys getting a little badge with like a little skeleton on it, or what's happening? Like I don't understand. This is just absurd. Anyway, so officers from the Port Police did most of the official work, but apparently the Boy Scouts were instructed to spread out across the lot and search for bones, clothing, and anything else that may belong to the newly unearthed victim. Like, just the absurdity of this. Like, I just cannot. Like, I don't mean to laugh, you know what I mean? But it's just so, like, guys, call other law enforcement. Why are we calling children to do this? Now, as the scouts searched the lot, one of the Boy Scouts stumbled upon a second skeleton. What?
Just.
I know you guys can't see her. She's just shaking her head. And she's just sighing. Like, what the fuck? So this skeleton was laying about 50 yards from where the first one was found. But unlike the first body, which had been buried in a very shallow grave, the second skeleton was only slightly obscured by some thick bushes. The body was also covered with trash and other debris. This one, it was as if the killer had deliberately taken his time burying the first victim, right? But then just discarded the second woman in the bushes, like, I don't want to do this. And just kind of threw her to the side. It's kind of like as if he wanted her to be found, in a way. You know what I mean? Now, a few days after they had the Boy Scouts help them find human remains,
Jesus Louise.
The medical examiner used dental records to identify that first set of bones as those of 20-year-old factory worker Constance Nayon, one of the names on their list of women who had been recently reported missing. Constance had last been seen on June 8th, leaving the factory where she worked. Just before she left, she had called her boyfriend to inform him that she was on her way to see him and should be there in about 20 minutes. However, when she didn't show up, and then didn't show up any time at all that night, he became concerned and reported her missing the following day. At the time of her disappearance, Constance was living out of her car. So unfortunately, she was homeless. Investigators found a 15-year-old Chevy Camaro parked in the lot of the Red Lion Motel. The car was cluttered with all of Constance's belongings and covered in dust, which indicated that the car had been sitting there undisturbed for several days. Now, the second set of remains was found to be that of Kelly Ware. She was yet another name on the task force list of missing women. Kelly had last been seen on or around July 18th. She was seen near a bus stop in a heavily trafficked area in Seattle, which was also known among police as a hot spot for drug dealers. Now, the killer had taken the time to bury her remains near the airport and had even placed a ring of stones around the burial site.
Damn.
Yeah, which is weird. Like many of the other victims, the advanced state of
really don't surprise me.
Right, at this point. I mean, this fucking guy was like, he was just doing too much, honestly. You just need to calm it down. That's what you need to do. Anyway, the advanced state of decomposition made it initially challenging for her body to be identified. However, the only significant evidence was a triangular-shaped stone that had been found in the region of her pelvis when the remains were finally uncovered. Now, it was difficult to determine whether the stone had just simply fallen, like into the grave where she had been buried, or if it had been deliberately placed there, as, incidents have occurred before with this guy. So they're not, they never really were sure. Well, this find caused their minds to immediately turn to the discovery of Marcia Faye Chapman, where the killer had brutally sexually assaulted her with those rocks. And those were found inside her. So,
damn.
You don't remember that one? That was in part 1.
I know, but still, damn.
I know, you can barely remember what you had for breakfast this morning, so.
I can remember what I had for breakfast this morning. Thank you very much. I ain't that old.
Yeah,
See how she treats me?
So in part 1, they found Marcia Faye Chapman. Inside of her, there were small stones that had been kind of
shoved in there.
Yeah. So this discovery made them. This discovery made them think of her, and they weren't they have to acknowledge that it is entirely possible that this stone was placed there deliberately. But because the remains were skeletal and the decomposition was so severe, it was impossible to determine that, as well as impossible to determine her cause of death. It could have been placed there, but then again, it could have just simply fell.
Yeah.
Now, the discovery of Kaylee Ware's remains brought the total number of missing women to 13. And there were still countless names on the list of other missing women. The task force had compiled this information from the Seattle Police Department's reports. Now, initially, several investigators were publicly skeptical that all the victims had been killed by one single person. So they're like, there's no way. The MO's kind of all over the fucking place. These women are being found in all kinds of different areas. So some were on there's 2 camps. One, this is one single guy. And then the other camp is there's no way it has to be more than one killer that we have at the same time, which is not impossible. It's happened before. So this thought was really because the case, it was still so new, and the similarities between the victims weren't really, they weren't immediately apparent to investigators, if that makes sense. Now, however, by the fall of 1983, it became increasingly difficult to ignore the similarities between all of the cases, though. Now, they didn't have any specific suspects in mind. The task force members had a theory about what might be motivating their killer, but that's all it was. It was just a theory. The King County Police Captain and the Green River Task Force Commander, Michael Knox, expressed a strong possibility that they were dealing with a serial murderer. So now they're like, this is one guy, and we believe that he's a serial killer. They believe the killer was psychologically disturbed and had a strong aversion to prostitutes. While this theory was helpful in tracking down the killer, Knox acknowledged that without any witnesses or crime scenes, investigators were struggling to really make any kind of significant progress in the case. Now, in most cases, when a killer is on the loose in one particular area, the public demands more from law enforcement. They want law enforcement to be present and actively involved in the investigation. However, the public often also prefers to hear about the psychological theories rather than the tangible actions being taken to address the situation. So they want to know that something's being done to prevent the killer from committing their crimes any further than they already have, rather than this is what we think. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay. I know what I'm trying to say, but it just wasn't quite coming out right. Now, one of the major tragedies of the Green River case, and many similar cases to it, is that the victims were among the most marginalized individuals in society. They were often ignored and overlooked, even when they were alive, but much more so once they were dead. Because again, during this time, they were seen as less dead.
Yeah, because see, back then, prostitution, they were nobody.
Right. They're less dead. You're doing it to yourself. Basically is what the thought was during that time, which is so fucked up.
It is fucked up because there are people too. I mean, if somebody's mother, sister, aunt, sometimes grandma.
Like we said in part 1, half of the women don't want to be in that life, but they're forced to be. The other half are doing it because that's the only way that they can take care of their family.
Exactly.
That's the only options they have. Disgusting.
No, thank you.
Right. I'm so glad that I didn't live then. Anyway. Now, in fact, Nault's statements about the killer's suppressed moral mission to rid the city of sex workers only reinforced the public sense of safety, even though it was a false safety. This false sense of security was based on the assumption that the killer would not target people outside the sex worker community. However, it was completely flawed. The killer was not limited to sex workers, and he was capable of targeting anyone who crossed his path, as we have already seen, because there are several victims within those 13 that we know of right now that had no known ties to sex work. But at the time, law enforcement is painting it as, well, if you're not a sex worker, then you're safe. Even though we all know that that was bullshit. Now, the public might think, well, okay, I'm never going to become a victim. That's not my line of work. That's not the case. We know that. And that's how it always goes. You always think it's never going to happen to you until it does. She's shaking her head.
You never know what's going to happen.
Right. You could just pass him on the street and you're going to be his next victim.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to remember that the Green River Killer wasn't targeting sex workers specifically. He was targeting anyone who was vulnerable and easy to target. That's what it was.
That's crazy.
Whereas there are other killers, such as like Ted Bundy. All of his victims look like his ex-girlfriend. Brown hair, all of that. Some serial killers do have a specific thing about their victims that they target. And then there's others who don't. They just kill to kill.
Wow.
So this is the aspect that really bothers me in cases just like this, because it's crucial to avoid giving someone a false sense of security. Instead, you should be encouraging vigilance. Watch those around you. Pay attention. Listen. Things like that. But in so many of these cases, that's not how it is. Oh, this is the victim pool over here, so as long as you don't fall in this area, then you're safe. It's ridiculous. Okay, so moreover, we shouldn't be overly judgmental either. Especially in the 70s and 80s, people were frequently taking rides with strangers. It wasn't just sex workers who were in danger. Hitchhiking was a major thing all the way into the 90s, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like, it was a huge thing. And not everyone that hitchhiked was a sex worker. Some of them just needed a fucking ride to work. Some of them were running away from their problems. And every single one of them were in danger. Now, everyone should be on high alert. Okay, that's the purpose of that little tangent I had. Anyway. Now, the editor of the News Tribune expressed surprise that there wasn't much public outcry over the Green River slayings. Like, the public appeared to have adopted a detached perspective on the murders, which is in stark contrast to the Ted Bundy killings of the 70s. So this, because this happened shortly after. The Ted Bundy killings was when young women, many of whom were students, were disappearing regularly from Seattle and in the local nearby areas. So it's puzzling why, they didn't seem as concerned. Well, let me say it this way. I don't think it's really puzzling. We know why. Because the women that Ted Bundy killed most of them were students. They were more, I don't know how to say it. Whereas most of the victims of the Green River Killer were sex workers. That's why there wasn't as much as a big outcry, which is you Google the Ted Bundy killings, you see newspaper articles on Google for days. Whereas you do it for the Green River Killer, it is so hard to find newspaper pictures online regarding the Green River killing. It's ridiculous. Now, it's important to note that the detectives here had some leads, okay? However, it seemed like the situation was constantly changing, and any eyewitness statements that they could obtain didn't always match up. There was a lot of chaos in the case, and it's understandable that the suspects were kind of everywhere. Now, throughout the investigation, there were some official suspects. So, in part one, we have Melvin Foster, who was initially ruled out. However, in late 1983, the task force focused on a new suspect named Charles Clinton Clark. Several women working the strip had described a man in his 30s driving a blue and white pickup truck. This description was similar to that of Gail Matthews' boyfriend, Kurt, who had seen her sitting inside this said truck. Clark was a meat cutter at a local butchery. He held a license for 2 handguns. He had also been identified by several women on the strip as having been violent towards them. At the very least, they were able to arrest Clark on sexual assault charges against one of the sex workers on the strip, which, of course, was a positive outcome, even though he's clearly not the Green River Killer.
Right.
Now, arresting Clark did remove him from the streets, which gave them time to continue investigating him as a potential suspect. While the task force and the FBI pursued him as their prime suspect, the killer continued his heinous activities. Now, as detectives were booking Clark at the Seattle Police Department, 18-year-old Mary Bridget Meehan had just left the room that she shared with her boyfriend Ray at the Western Six Motel, which is located right near the strip. At the time, Mary was 8 months pregnant. At this point, she was certainly not engaged in any kind of sex work. However, she did have a history of running away from home, and she was believed to have occasionally worked the strip to earn money. But it's just a belief. Now, according to Ray, Mary had mentioned that she had intended to walk down to the movie theater, which was only about 2 miles away. When night fell and she still hadn't returned from the theater, Ray had become concerned and decided to go look for her. He said he spent hours walking the strip, asking other women if they had seen her, but they hadn't. After exhausting his efforts, Ray returned home and called the police. He was informed that he would have to wait a full 24 hours before reporting someone missing. Every time I hear this, I want to scream. It infuriates me. Just like we've said, there is no such thing as having to wait to report someone missing. And then the fact that she's 8 months pregnant and they're like, oh, you still got to wait 24 hours is insane. Like, 8 months pregnant, this lady did not decide to just walk away from her boyfriend. Like, we need to be so for real right now. That did not fucking happen. And for anyone, but especially law enforcement, to say, oh, your girlfriend's missing and she's 8 months pregnant. Oh, she just decided to leave you. You need to be slapped across the face. Okay? Because how many times has that actually happened? Because I know I was not trying to run away and be by myself and no 8 months pregnant. I was trying to get a good night's freaking sleep. You know what I'm saying? Like, run away from her life at 8 months pregnant. The fuck? What? What's that look for?
What you're saying is like, you just want to rest when you're 8 months pregnant.
Right.
Your belly sticking out 40 miles, you know?
Right. Like, you're not just walking away from your life at 8 months pregnant.
You're waddling, you're not walking.
Like, that's not happening. Like, anyway, Ray had waited until the following evening after he'd been told that, but she still hadn't come. So he called the police for a second time and finally was able to report her missing. This time, the officer did take the report, and he filed it with the other incoming communications from that night. It would be several days before the report of this pregnant 18-year-old was assigned to a detective. So several more days. She'd already been missing 24 hours. Now he makes the official report. It's several more days before it's actually assigned to a detective. Eventually, Detective Earl Tripp was assigned to her case. Now, Mary and her brother Tim had been adopted by a couple with 2 other children in Bellevue, Washington when they were young. They were raised just about 20 miles from where Mary would eventually disappear from. However, unlike many other victims, Mary's childhood had been mostly positive. Her brother Dennis recalled that Mary would frequently bring home stray cats and hide them in her bedroom. He said that they would then find the cats and their mother would say, quote, "You can't keep them. You see how everyone's sneezing?" However, which is just so sweet. She's like, "I see these little stray cats. I just want to bring them home." And then she would hide them in her bedroom. Her mom's like, "No, everybody's allergic to these cats. We can't keep these cats, sweetheart." That would be Logan, for sure.
Oh, no kidding.
Despite her mother's warnings, though, Mary would continue to bring home more stray cats. However, whenever Mary reached her early teens, things seemed to change. There was a sense of tension that arose due to, typical teenage issues.
Oh, been there, done that.
Mary and her brother were always the more rebellious ones compared to their siblings. And as teenagers, their rebellion manifested as a pushback against their parents' authority, leading to that inevitable conflict that comes with those teenage years.
Hey, you're about to enter that.
I know, God. Over time, Mary began to skip school. She was spending time with older boys. And at 15, she met her first boyfriend, who was the son of a prominent local businessman. According to her parents, Mary was entranced with him. And despite their disapproval, he became her entire world. Consequently, her grades plummeted and she started staying out really late. The Meehans tried various methods to control their daughter, including routine, punishments, and even rewards. However, they eventually realized that their efforts were ineffective. And hoping that tough love would bring her back on track, they gave her an ultimatum. Either follow the house rules or find another place to live. The Meehans obviously genuinely believed that they were doing the right thing, and they had exhausted all other options that they knew of. Not only that, they didn't actually think she would leave home. Like, where the fuck is she going to go? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But she left. Mary's boyfriend was initially happy to have her with him, but soon she became pregnant. Neither of them had planned for it, and it happened just after Mary turned 16. They found themselves in a very difficult situation. Her boyfriend wanted her to have an abortion, but Mary, who was a devout Catholic, strongly opposed that idea. Frustrated by Mary's decision, her boyfriend kicked her out of their newly rented apartment. Consequently, she spent the next few months sleeping on friends' couches until the mother of one of Mary's friends agreed to let her move in. In the time that followed, Mary's life gradually returned to normal. However, her relationship with her parents never fully healed from this whole thing. Despite their love for each other and their efforts to mend their relationship, the situation was very complex. Throughout this time, they had repeatedly expressed their willingness to welcome her back into their home if she would adhere to the house rules. However, according to her friends, Mary was simply not ready to make that commitment. It seemed like a stalemate, with neither party willing to move. As if that wasn't enough, Mary was also becoming a parent and was still relatively young herself. If life had continued without the unfortunate involvement of Gary Ridgway, she had plenty of time to rebuild her life, reunite, and fix her relationship with her parents. But unfortunately, she crossed paths with this man. Now, it's important to note that this relationship wasn't entirely ruined. It was just simply a matter of timing and circumstance. She was young, still fighting against, I don't want my parents to control me, whereas her parents are just trying to love her. Now, by the time Mary had turned 18, she was definitely struggling. She was grappling with substance abuse and was asked to move out of her friend's house. By then, she had already been spending a lot of time on the streets and had made friends with other young women who were living and working there also. Her friend Dave had admired her fearless qualities at the time. However, in retrospect, he realized that they were both just scared of life and that things weren't going well for either of them. They were accepting failure as a given and moving forward from there. Dave had been Mary's closest friends in the years after she had left her parents' house and was incredibly devoted to her. But as Mary's situation worsened and she fell deeper into a life on the streets, her friendship began to change. Despite still being a teenager, Dave's life was filled with typical suburban teen angst that many experienced during adolescence. While the issues weren't overly serious, Mary's troubles were dire, mature, and vastly different from what Dave was experiencing. One day, Mary had confided in Dave that a man had approached her at the Seattle Center and offered her money for sex. She told him that initially she agreed and she went with him. And she had never done it before, but eventually she realized that she just couldn't go through with it, and she told this man that. Now, fortunately, the man was understanding and he was sympathetic to her situation. He bought her some food, sat with her while she shared her family problems, and that was it. They moved on. Dave had initially laughed off the situation, making a lighthearted joke about she should have asked him for more money. However, in hindsight, after the fact, because remember, at the time that he's being told this, he's just a very young adult himself,
Yeah.
So he recognized that this part of her story was a major red flag, a sign that she was headed down a very dangerous path. Now, a few months later, Dave had started to date a young woman from Bellevue, and this new relationship dramatically changed the dynamic between him and Mary. A short time later, the two drifted apart, and he never saw her again. After that, not because of it though, Mary just kind of hit rock bottom. At one point, she did move back in with her parents. She finally agreed to abide by their rules, but this was when she was 18. So like I said, their relationship isn't completely demolished. There was plenty of time for them to help her get back on track, get herself together, and do what she needed to do. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Now, once she moved in with her parents, she began to date Ray, who we had talked about at the beginning that reported her missing. And then shortly after that, she found out that she was pregnant again. So
again.
Yep. So for her second child. The second child is Ray's. The first one, that guy said, I don't want this kid, fuck you, and was an asshole. So the old tension between Mary and her parents, of course, flared back up. She fell back into that old routine of staying out all night, and it just kind of went down that whole path again. Now, all of this is what made Mary both like and not like the other missing women on the list. On the one hand, she had a support system that she knew she could fall back on during desperate times. Her love for and her connection to her family made it unlikely that she would run away without telling anyone. They didn't always get along, but she wouldn't have just vanished completely, because she never did. And that's because no matter how bad things got, she was never going to abandon them, and they were never going to abandon her. On the other hand, she was still just a teenager. She had a stubborn, rebellious streak that caused her to act impulsively and take a little bit of unnecessary risk in order to prove her independence and to just kind of do her own thing. She's also 18 and pregnant with her second child. So there's a lot that makes her like the other victims, but there's a lot that makes her different also. Now, the missing persons report got added to the Green River Task Force list of missing women, and it was assigned to Detective Jerry Alexander for follow-up. Now, Alexander started by interviewing Ray, who was obviously the last person to see Mary and the person who reported her missing. Despite his obvious love for her, Ray ultimately proved to be of very little use, according to one of the investigators. They said that they doubted many of his answers. It wasn't so much that they thought he was lying. They just didn't. It was just more of like he really didn't seem to know anything.
He didn't.
Right. So he did mention that she had gone to the movies, but when they inquired if Mary had might have gone to make money on the streets, he replied, I don't know. So it's not really a lie. She said she was going to the movies. He can't say if that was her actual plan or not. You know? Now, it seemed like he was at a loss for words. Mary's other friends, though, proved to be a little bit more helpful in providing information about her living situation at the time, and whether or not she was indeed working as a sex worker. Despite her pregnancy, the consensus among her friends and family was that she was not resorting to prostitution. Even when she wasn't pregnant, they said this was not something that this was not what she was doing at all. Now, they spent months searching for her, but there was never any signs of her whereabouts. By the end of 1982, Ray had moved out of the motel. Now, initially, he remained in contact with her parents, hoping that maybe she would return, but eventually, those calls would stop. Mary remained on the missing persons list until a body was discovered. And initially, she was not believed to be a part of the Green River victims. Now, finally, the day had arrived on November 14, 1983, when the bodies of Constance Nayon and Kelly Ware were discovered a few weeks later. As technicians continued their search in the vacant lot where their bodies were found, they unearthed a third body buried approximately 100 yards from Constance's. However, it became evident that this third victim had been deceased significantly longer than the other two. During this autopsy, the pathologist observed that the internal organs appeared intact but were engelled. You know what that means?
No.
They were essentially like one just large mass. Like all the organs were there, but they had just kind of like all
jellied together,
yeah.
Ew.
Yep, it's called engelled.
Ew.
Yeah. One particular finding during the autopsy was the presence of multiple fetal bone fragments in the right lower quadrant of the abdomen. These fragments constituted a complete fetal skeleton, revealing that this was indeed the remains of a pregnant woman.
Aww.
The discovery of the fetal bones confirmed that Seattle law enforcement was dealing with a monstrous entity unlike anything that they had ever encountered before. This was a full fetal skeleton, indicating that the victim was 8 months pregnant and past viability, which I'm sure we all know exactly who the victim was, but for investigators, she was not yet identified. Later that afternoon, the medical examiner matched the teeth in the jaw to the dental records of Mary Bridget Meehan. While he couldn't provide precise information about the time or her cause of death, he estimated that she had likely died not long after her disappearance on September 15, 1982. Mary Meehan was the last of 3 victims to be discovered in the Port Authority lot. But unfortunately, these discoveries didn't significantly advance the case any further. Riker later recalled that they were finding bones every week. And by late 1983, the task force had already been disbanded once. In 1982, despite their efforts, they failed to identify any new suspects. Additionally, a months-long break in any new victims gave the false impression that the killer had simply moved on. So, they got rid of the task force. But following the election of a new sheriff in 1983, they had been reconstructed once the bodies began to once again pile up. One of the investigators would later reveal that they had amassed over 10,000 pieces of evidence and over 40,000 tip sheets in this case. How wild is that?
It is.
You're just like, I don't know what to say. Now, in order for them to organize this vast amount of information, they employed a Rolodex system, which consisted of piles of papers with knobs on the ends of spindles to categorize names for easy reference. Anyway, now behind the scenes, the Green River investigation had become unlike anything King County had ever attempted. By this time, detectives had accumulated tens of thousands of tips and thousands of pieces of physical evidence. So every item had to be cataloged, compared, and revisited as new victims were discovered. Investigators compared tire impressions from remote dump sites. They examined paint transfers found on victims' clothing. They analyzed fibers that was recovered from evidence. They studied ligatures, looking for similarities in knots, materials, and methods of strangulation. As bodies continued appearing across several counties, detectives began mapping every recovery site, hoping that geography would reveal patterns that eyewitnesses couldn't. The task force had also embraced technology that was remarkably advanced for the early 1980s. Information from thousands of reports was entered into computerized databases designed to identify connections that investigators might otherwise miss. Also at the time, detectives consulted not just one profiler, but several experts, including specialists from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, hoping that psychology could succeed where physical evidence could not. And this is where we get our first FBI profile. However, despite all of it, the killer still remained unidentified. By late 1983, the Green River Task Force had reached a sobering realization. Waiting for the next body wasn't an investigation. It was a recovery operation. If they were ever going to stop this killer, they needed to catch him before another woman disappeared. And so, their strategy changed. The task force shifted from reacting to murders to trying to prevent the next one. Detectives flooded the Pacific Highway South Corridor, the stretch of road where so many of the victims had last been seen. And this wasn't just a handful of officers driving around. At times, the operation involved hundreds of law enforcement personnel from multiple agencies. Plainclothes detectives that were blended into the crowds, unmarked surveillance vehicles that would sit for hours in motel parking lots, undercover officers posed as customers, bartenders, motel employees, and even drivers. And perhaps the most dangerous assignment belonged to the female officers who would volunteer to work as decoys. Just like the woman the killer targeted, they would walk the strip night after night, hoping the man responsible would approach them instead of someone else. Other detectives watched from a distance, ready to move in if anything would happen. Helicopters would occasionally circle overhead. Surveillance teams photographed license plates. Every suspicious vehicle was documented, and every encounter recorded. The Pacific Highway had essentially become one giant surveillance operation. The task force wasn't simply sitting behind desks waiting for phone calls anymore. Now, they were trying to force the killer to make a mistake. The problem was, he never did. As detectives continued interviewing women working along the strip, a curious pattern began to emerge. Their stories were different. The locations varied. The dates were spread over months. But one detail refused to go away: a pickup truck. Some described it as blue. Others said a bluish green. A few remembered faded paint. Several specifically mentioned a large gray primer spot on the truck, which appeared to have been repaired but never repainted. Just as interesting was the driver. Nearly every description painted the same picture: an ordinary white man, clean cut, quiet, soft-spoken, polite, not intimidating, not aggressive. In fact, several women later told detectives that he seemed almost shy. He didn't fit the image most people had of a dangerous predator. Instead, he appeared to be patient, almost forgettable. Some women even remembered that he had introduced himself simply as Gary. At the time, that name meant nothing. Seattle was full of men named Gary. The task force wrote it down alongside thousands of other tips. But years later, that ordinary first name would become one of the most chilling details in the entire investigation. However, due to the limited number of witnesses and even fewer leads, that progress was slow. Consequently, many of the detectives on the task force spent their days fielding calls about missing girls and women or conversing with family members regarding their missing loved ones. In 1983, the task force primary subject, Charles Clark, who we talked about earlier, would eventually be ruled out. By this point, detectives couldn't afford to ignore anyone. Every credible suspect had to be investigated. And one of the men who consumed an enormous amount of the task force attention was David, or Dave Cook. Cook attracted investigators because on paper, he checked several of those troubling boxes. He had a history of violence toward women. He was
nice guy.
Right. He was familiar with the areas where the victims disappeared, and aspects of his behavior raised enough concern that detectives devoted significant time and resources trying to either connect him to the murders or eliminate him as a suspect altogether. Investigators would interview him repeatedly. They examined his movements. They compared what they knew about him against the growing victim timeline. And for a time, some detectives genuinely wondered if they had finally found their man. But, just like Melvin Foster and later Charles Clark, the evidence simply wasn't there. And eventually, Cook, too, was ruled out. It was another frustrating reminder that following every lead, even promising ones, often brought investigators right back to where they started. Nevertheless, he wasn't the sole suspect on the team's radar. On May 3rd, just days before Carol Ann Christensen's remains were discovered in a peculiar scene in the forest, Bobby Woods reported his girlfriend, 18-year-old Mary Malvar, missing to the police in Des Moines. To avoid implicating himself in the crime, he did provide vague details about her disappearance. This ambiguity only fueled the detective's suspicions, leading them to believe that Bobby might have some kind of involvement in Mary disappearing. Eventually, Bobby revealed the entire story to the detectives. He was subsequently ruled out as a suspect. However, someone else would take his place. According to Woods, he and Mary had gone to Pacific High Race South to earn some money. For several months, the couple had employed a simple system to make money and ensure Mary's safety. They would work the street, and when Mary found a client and got into the man's car, Bobby would follow behind that car and wait nearby to ensure the transaction proceeded smoothly. On the night of April 30th, 1983, they visited the Strip, as they always did, and Mary was approached by a man in a blue and white truck. Interestingly, this incident occurred at the same intersection where Kurt had last seen Gail Matthews only 8 days earlier. Mary opened the passenger's door and got in as Bobby pulled out onto the street. The truck pulled away, maintaining a distance to avoid appearing suspicious. Bobby had been following the truck for several miles on the highway, occasionally pulling up, next to it just to check on Mary and, kind of get a look at the guy she was sitting next to. Bobby noticed that Mary seemed to be upset and suspected that she and the man in the truck may have had some kind of argument. Eventually, the truck did pull off the highway and drove into the lot of the motel. Bobby followed and parked his car across the street where he could see. The truck idled in the parking lot for a little while, but then the driver pulled out and got back onto the highway. So, Bobby followed. Not long after, Bobby started to feel that something was very wrong. The driver was now going much faster than he was before, as if he suspected that he was being followed. Bobby, who was determined to keep up, and the truck sped down the highway at very high speeds. Without signaling, the truck made a sudden turn off an exit ramp, sending them back into downtown Seattle. Despite this setback, though, Bobby continued to follow the truck. After leaving the highway, Bobby spotted an upcoming red light and slammed on his brakes to stop. However, the driver of the truck disregarded the light and drove up a steep hill on South 216th Street. Unable to navigate through the light or gain enough momentum, Bobby quickly lost sight of the truck, and that was the last time that he ever saw Marie. The next day, Bobby visited Marie's father, Joe, and recounted the events that had transpired. Joe Malvar had never been fond of Bobby Woods, and he blamed him for Marie's recent troubles and her disappearance. Joe demanded that Bobby accompany him in his truck and Marie's brother. So Bobby, Joe, and her brother James spent the rest of the day driving around the area surrounding the strip where Bobby had lost the truck the previous night. Their objective was to find any sign of Marie or the truck that she had last been seen in. As they drove along South 216th Street, Bobby noticed a street sign at the corner of a small side street that he had been unable to see in the darkness the night before. The street led down to a small cul-de-sac with just a few houses. Upon reaching the end of the cul-de-sac, they spotted the truck. The truck was parked on the side with its primer visible. Bobby and Joe sat across the street from the house and observed the scene, but there was no sign of Marie. Instead, they saw two men engaged in conversation inside the house. After a while, Joe suggested a plan that I found quite ingenious, honestly. He suggested that Bobby approach one of the neighbors and ask if they could use one of their phones to call the police. Joe instructed Bobby to get out of the car and go to the neighbor's house. Bobby complied with that request, and shortly after, Des Moines police officer Bob Fox arrived at the scene. Joe informed the officer of their findings and what was happening, and so Fox walked up to the house and knocked on the door. A man in his 30s opened it just a few seconds later. Joe, Bobby, and James all watched as the officer spoke to the man inside, nodding occasionally. About a minute later, the door closed, and Officer Fox returned. He informed them that there was no woman in the house, because the guy told you that. He also mentioned that there hadn't been any women in the house either. Now, I understand, protocols, all right? But I couldn't help questioning his reasoning behind this, okay? We'll get there. Okay? This is just, it infuriates me. This man tells you, there's no women in here. I'm just going to take your word for it, sir. Thank you for your time. Ugh. Now, Officer Fox thanked the man for his time. Okay? He walked back to his patrol car, made a few notes. The man who answered the door lived an ordinary life. He was married. He had a steady job as a truck painter. He attended church. His neighbors didn't consider him threatening. His coworkers described him as quiet, dependable, and easy to overlook. Nothing about him suggested that he was capable of unimaginable violence. And after Officer Fox spoke to the three men, before leaving, he wrote one final detail in his report: the man's name, Gary Leon Ridgway.
Damn.
And then he drove away. At that moment, neither Fox nor anyone else knew they had just been face to face with the man that the Green River Task Force had spent more than a year desperately trying to find. Officer Bob Fox had undoubtedly heard about the Green River killings as he worked in a different jurisdiction. However, he didn't have direct involvement because of that. And so he only knew what he was reading in the newspapers, and he wasn't privy to information that others weren't. Fox admitted to having heard about the Green River killings and acknowledged that they were happening. He identified the man that he spoke to in that house as Gary Ridgway, the infamous Green River killer. Fox expressed that the man didn't appear to be a typical serial killer. Have you ever seen Gary Ridgway? He's fucking creepy. He is so creepy looking. Like, here you go.
Ew.
Right, he's just creepy. Ugh. Okay. Ugh. The man Fox spoke to was the very image of a serial killer that would make anyone cross the street to avoid him. However, Fox acknowledged that there are serial killers who don't fit the conventional image, and he's not wrong. He mentioned that Ted Bundy was once considered attractive, and women were writing to him in prison and even trying to marry him. Not wrong. Fox also mentioned that Bundy had killed numerous women. Despite Fox's initial suspicion that the man in the house didn't look like a serial killer, he simply made a few notes, filed the report, and moved on with his day. For Joe Malvar, the experience confirmed his suspicions that Bobby Woods was a liar and that he had never seen a man in a truck. Malvar speculated that Woods was covering up something that had caused Marie to leave. He also believed that she would return, which was likely wishful thinking on his part. Regardless, she was missing, and her name was added to that list of missing women. Her friends and family spent the next several months searching for any sign of her whereabouts. Woods recounted to a reporter many years later that every night they would go without sleep. On the night of April 17th, just a few weeks before Marie Malvar went missing, 16-year-old Kimmy Pizzo was walking in downtown Seattle with her boyfriend, who was also her pimp. She noticed a man sitting in a truck at the corner of 4th and Blanchard. The man beckoned Kimmy to come over, and her boyfriend watched as she spoke to him before getting into the passenger side of the car. The last thing Kimmy's boyfriend noticed as the truck drove away was a large primer spot on the driver's side door. Tragically, Kimmy's story was eerily similar to that of the other victims. As a young child, Kimmy was bright-eyed, outgoing, and she adored unicorns. Her mother, Joyce, recalled that Kimmy was very adventurous and never accepted anyone's word without questioning it. As she reached adolescence, though, she developed a defiant streak and began rebelling against her parents and their rules. By her mid-teens, she had deeply fallen in love with a boy and devoted all of her time to him. This infatuation led her to skip school, disregard her curfew, and in general defy her parents. In February of 1983, Kimmy left home and moved in with her boyfriend. When money became scarce, he suggested that she try sex work. He even told her to get a job and called her a loser. Now, initially, they planned to move to Portland, where they believed girls could earn better money. However, when that proved to not be the case, they returned to Seattle. A few weeks later, Kimmy would vanish without a trace. It took a few days before her boyfriend would eventually report her missing. Unfortunately, he had very little information about who he saw in the truck, including the name or the appearance of the man that he saw. He said the man was white and appeared to be in his 30s. Said he was driving a blue-green pickup truck with a primer spot on the door. This eyewitness said that the truck was hauling a small camper this time around. Reviewing the missing persons list, certain details began to catch the attention of detectives on the task force. Most notably, several eyewitness statements mentioned that truck with the primer spot on the door. However, until they found a match, that lead remained just that. Another significant aspect of the cases was the occurrence of certain dates. Kimmy Pizzo had disappeared on April 17, 1983. And another young sex worker, 17-year-old Sanda Gabbard, had also vanished on that same day. Just 3 days earlier, on April 14, 1983, 19-year-old Andrea Childers had disappeared from the same area. Now, a few weeks later, Marie Malvar disappeared from the Strip. While not every name on the missing persons list would ultimately be linked to the Green River Killer, if even half of the missing individuals were, in fact, victims, it painted a very concerning picture of a man who was murdering women at an alarming rate. Although he had been doing this throughout the time, it was now becoming increasingly evident. 5 days before Christmas, in 1983, the task force members received news about Kimmy's fate. On the afternoon of December 20th, someone reported to the police that they had been walking through Mountain View Cemetery, approximately 20 miles from the airport. That's when they stumbled upon a human skull laying on the ground. Detective Frank Adamson expressed their initial belief that the killer was just playing tricks on them, while some of the other investigators had speculated that the body might have been concealed and then carried away by a coyote to the location where it was then found. However, the detectives in the search and rescue teams meticulously combed the cemetery for 2 days, but failed to discover any additional remains. So all they found was a skull. The following day, a forensic dentist was able to identify Kimmy's remains using her dental chart, which had been provided by her mother. Now, since only her skull was found and no other remains were present, it was impossible to determine what her cause of death was. Now, as December transitioned into January, the task force began the new year with a period of relative tranquility. After the discovery of Kimmy's skull in the cemetery, 2 months passed without any further bodies being found. Then, as if on a predetermined schedule, the discovery resumed, leading to one of the most perplexing and inexplicable phases of the entire investigation. That calm that the task force had throughout January was finally shattered on February 14, 1984, Valentine's Day, when a set of skeletal remains were discovered approximately half a mile from Interstate 90, which was about 30 miles east of Seattle. It would take over a year for forensic dentists to identify the remains through old childhood x-rays. These remains belonged to Delise Missy Palger. She was a street worker and an occasional sex worker who had gone missing on October 30th, the year before. Now, a brief review of Missy's background revealed that her life was quite similar to that of many of the other victims. She had been removed from her mother's care and placed into foster care when she was only 5 years old. Missy was transferred from one foster home to another for a considerable period. She had also developed a significant juvenile record. and the last time anyone had seen Missy, she was waiting at a bus stop on Seattle's south side. Now, 1 week after the remains were discovered near Interstate 90, Seattle Post-Intelligencer reporter Mike Barber, who had been exclusively writing about the Green River Killer, received an anonymous letter at the newspaper's office. The letter was in a plain white envelope with typewritten text on the outside. In addition to the address, the sender had added the note, "Very important," but they had spelled important incorrectly. They had spelled it INPORTENT.
My brain's just going, huh?
So like N4 and then 10.
They sounded it out.
Yeah. Now, when Barber opened the letter, he found a white sheet with more typewritten text on it. At first glance, it appeared to be just complete gibberish. However, after reading and rereading it many times, he realized that this wasn't gibberish at all. Instead, it was just jumbled sentences that had all been connected together. So there weren't, spaces in between the sentences. So it took some time, but eventually he managed to untangle the context of the letter, and it made it more readable. So I'm going to give you an excerpt of, how he wrote it out. And then I'll read you like the translated version. So he wrote the entire message in one letter. Then he added EED, so Ed, TONO, ABOUT, THE, Green River Man.
Okay.
So the message essentially conveyed what you need to know about the Green River Killer. That's basically what it says. Because if you break it up, it's TO2, NO, no, ABOUT, about, and then THE, the. It was just all put together, no space, and spelled wrong. Now, the next part of the message advised against throwing away the remains, which they wouldn't have done anyway. Now, the first part of this message mentions that one of the victims had a broken or dislocated arm. It also states that a blackened river had a stone in the vagina of another victim. The message questions why some of the victims were found in the river, some above ground, and then some underground. It suggested that there might be an insurance scam involved. And it asks who benefited from the deaths of the victims. The message also mentions that some of the victims had their fingernails cut off. It suggests that the killer had sex with the victims after they were dead.
Ew!
The message also mentions that the killer had smoked and chewed gum. And it implies that the killer might have been blackmailed by one of the victims. It also suggests that the killer's modus operandi changed from a businessman to a salesman. I'm not sure.
Probably salesman.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to assume. But honestly, who knows?
He ain't the brightest crayon in the box, is he?
I don't know. So it mentions that the killer had made car and motel reservations as well. And that the killer saw a large piece of luggage coming out of a motel. And that the luggage was heavy and the killer needed help. Very vague. You haven't caught on to that. The killer gave the keys and ID to the car to the person who was helping him. The person who helped the killer was said to be an out-of-state police officer. Yeah, the message is very vague and in a lot of places doesn't really make a lot of sense.
You think?
It advises against killing in one's own area and suggests that the killer should look inside out. Yeah. It mentions that one of the victims had old scars, that the mother of one of the victims, Apple, had red wine, lambrusco, and some fish dumped into the river. It mentions that drugs were being sold within the area, that the head of one of the victims was found, but it doesn't specify who found it or when they found it. Then it goes on to ask, what are they holding in their mouth, or is it a trick? Why are some clothes left behind while others are taken? And it says that the killer is wearing at least one ring, that there's one real estate man and one long-haul truck driver who was last seen wearing one. Some individuals had rope marks on their hands and necks. It says one black man was found in the river with only oral injuries.
Oral injuries?
Yes, that's what it says.
Yeah.
All of them were strangled, but with different methods. One black in the river had worked for the Metro. Yeah. Most of them had pimps bedding them. What it says. Escort modeling forced them to leave due to fear or death. Perhaps a pimp hater is getting back at them. Who finds the bones? What are they there for? Then there's a man with a gun or a knife. Someone paid to kill others. Are they? Are they killing who they are or what they are? Any dead person dies for the rest. Or maybe it's a man named Portland who worked there. What kind of man is this? There was a book left at Denny's. It belonged to a cop. And then it simply ends with "Call me Fred." So to Barber and everyone else in the newsroom, it seemed to be highly unlikely that this letter came from the killer. They all believed that it had been written by someone who wanted to play detective, trying to offer motives that anyone could consider. Now, while that could have been true, the letter also contains a significant amount of information that was not publicly available yet. This made it plausible that it could have been, in fact, from the killer. So consequently, Barber decided to turn the letter over to Dave Reichert at the Green River Task Force just in case. After reading the letter multiple times, Reichert handed it over to Tanya Izagiri, I think is how you say it, the task force fingerprint specialist. Now, despite the challenges of the 1980s, Reichert managed to obtain a clear fingerprint from the letter, which was subsequently filed for future reference. And with the letter's evidential contents exhausted, Reichert forwarded it to John Douglas at the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, trying to get his insights and any potential leads on where the letter came from. A few weeks later, Reichert received the letter along with Douglas's report. In this report, Douglas analyzed the communique and concluded that the author exhibited average intelligence and made a feeble attempt to gain some personal significance by manipulating the investigation. Douglas speculated that the letter writer might have access to the task force files, or that they had a relationship with someone who was directly on the force. He ultimately concluded that the author of the communique had no connection to the actual Green River homicides. So as the world's leading authority on serial killers, the task force members accepted Douglas's determination that the letter was fake as the final word on the matter. So the letter was filed away with other communications that had been received from the public and similar sources. It would be over 2 decades before Reichert and the other investigators would discover that this was an exceptional case. Despite Douglas's expertise, he had made an error, and the letter that Mike Barber had received at the Post-Intelligencer was indeed from the Green River killer.
Dang.
Yep. So let's consider the nature of John Douglas and other profilers like him. While they are undoubtedly highly educated and talented, their conclusions are ultimately informed guesses.
Yeah.
This field is inherently imperfect and infallible. While John Douglas was rarely wrong, this particular instance stands as a notable exception. Not very often, John Douglas looked at something, analyzed a person or a crime, and was wrong in his findings. But it did happen sometimes. He may be good at his job, but he was only human. It is important to recognize that no human is 100% correct. Not every single time. Profiling during this time was still in the very early stages. Now, today, we have a wealth of information on this subject. And because of that, they're even less wrong now than they used to be. But we have to remember that during the time that John Douglas was doing what he did, it was still very new.
Yeah.
So mistakes were made. Sometimes they were wrong. It's just kind of what it is. Now, the entire concept of profiling was still pretty new. And John Douglas himself was making some major progress. So you can't really, you can't shoot him because he was wrong in this one, because he was right in so many other cases. Okay. So in the end, Gary Ridgway did in fact write that letter.
He's something.
Yeah. And that's where we're going to end part 2. Because it's a lot of lives. I think we all need a little bit of a break right there. What do you think?
It's something.
Yeah. A lot of that one you didn't know. That's how I was. I thought I knew this one until I really...
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're about stupid when it comes to this.
Okay, so next week we're going to delve deeper into the investigation. We're going to focus on more victims. We're going to look at a revised FBI profile. And then we have an unexpected twist involving another serial killer.
Oh, great.
We're going to enter a new phase of the investigation, and things are about to become even more unsettling than they already are. Yep. And I'm trying to decide. So everybody, y'all will have to let me know what y'all want. So I'm trying to decide. Okay, I've got 3 parts so far. The last one, we can do 5 parts total, or I can put part 4 and 5 together, and it'll just be really long.
It don't matter to me. I'm sitting here either way.
You guys let me know what you want. I can break them up, or we can just do one really long part 4. Let me know. That's it. That's all we got, unless you got anything else.
I ain't got nothing.
All right. Next week's going to be a good one. Not good, but you know what I mean. That sounded really bad. You know what I mean.
I knew what you meant.
Yeah. We have an unexpected player that enters next week. Yep. Okay. Y'all, that's all we have for this one. To go watch something fun. Get you a palate cleanser in there. Sorry.
Who's texting you?
I don't know.
Well, they need to stop.
Mm-hmm.
You said you're October 9th?
Yeah.
With a rheumatologist?
Yep.
That's a school day.
I know.
What about the boys?
Yeah, I'll figure it out.
Well, Mike can always pick them up in the truck.
Yeah, we'll figure it out.
And Logan may want to walk home.
Right. We'll figure it out. And I mean, they may have football or something, in band, and so we'll figure it out. Okay. That's all we got, guys. Thanks for coming and hanging out with us for part 2. Next week, we're going to go into part 3. Make sure you let me know if you want one large part 4 or if you want it broke up part 4, part 5. You can send those to our email, any of our socials. Those are going to be linked in the episode description. As always, you can send us listener tales to all of those places as well. Case suggestions. Please make sure you give us a rating and a review. While you're there, hit the subscribe button. Turn on your downloads so you never miss an episode. You get that notification as soon as it drops. And, as always, remember to
watch out for monsters.
Don't kill people. And we'll catch y'all next time. Bye, y'all.
Bye, y'all.
This episode is sponsored by Invisaware, discreet safety jewelry and accessories that can instantly alert your trusted contacts and share your location with just a click. No subscriptions, no hassle, just added peace of mind. Get 10% off your order at invisaware.com/monsters.